Child sexual abuse has most likely been a social issue since time began. However, child sexual abuse has been a public social issue since the 19th century when protective organizations for children were formed. In the 1970s and 80s, the prosecution of child sex offenders drastically increased. This increase was due to public awareness of the issue. Thousands of criminal cases for child sex crimes are filed each year. The U.S. Supreme Court stated, "The prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse of children constitutes a government objective of surpassing importance." The Florida Supreme Court stated that society has a strong interest in eliminating the sexual abuse of children through vigorous enforcement of child abuse laws. Therefore, all of society agrees that child sex abuse is a problem that should be addressed.
The major goal of Shift the Shame campaign is to continue to raise public awareness in an effort to find justice for victims of child sexual abuse.
There is a debate as to what type of involvement the criminal justice system should play in responding to child sexual abuse. Many feel that the law is poorly equipped to deal with the social and psychological aspects of child sex abuse. Critics of prosecution maintain that the best way to deal with the problem is through prevention and therapy rather than through prison sentences. Those in favor of prosecution of child sexual offenders point out that most often prevention fails. Proponents of prosecution take the stance that anyone who sexually abuses a child has committed a serious crime and should be held accountable.
After going through the court system as a victim of child sexual crimes, I believe that both sides make good points. I feel that the law is poorly equipped to deal with the social and psychological aspects of child sexual abuse, and that those who commit crimes against children should be held accountable. The only solution then is to find a way to equip our legal system to adequately and effectively deal with the prosecution of child sex offenders. Another goal of Shift the Shame is to make necessary changes in our legal system.
What exactly happens once a child sex crime is reported? If the abuse involved a family member, the case is handled by the police and child protective services. Many of these reports are never investigated by the police and prosecutors' offices. If the crime is investigated, the first step in investigating the crime is an interview with the child victim by child interviewing experts.
For my family, CPS closed our case after a short phone interview with my mother where she told them we did not have any contact with our father. Child Protective Services told my mother that if we were near our father, they would take us away from her. However, no measures were taken by CPS to ensure that we were not in contact with our father. We were never interviewed as part of the investigation by King County Prosecutor's Office. Also, the prosecutor's office did not investigate the case for 5 years.
Once the investigation is completed, the prosecutor's office decides if the evidence is strong enough to merit the pressing of criminal charges. The biggest deciding factor in the pressing of criminal charges is the child's ability to effectively testify as a strong witness to the crime in court. The younger the child, the less likely charges will be made because they are ineffective witnesses. The tragic consequence of this is that the law is least able to protect the youngest and most vulnerable victims.
The crimes committed against me were charged only because my mother witnessed something suspicious. However, my father had many victims. All of his victims were under the age of 2 years old, with the youngest being a newborn baby. None of these crimes were charged against him, even though he admitted on tape in sick detail to the crimes.
Research shows that reports of abuse toward children under the age of 6 years old most often do not lead to prosecution unless there is evidence to corroborate the crime or if there is medical evidence.
In my case, we did have both medical evidence and corroboration. However, they were not adequately brought out in the investigation process.
Most people think of child sex abuse cases ending in criminal trials. However, a trial is the exception and not the rule. What happens rather than a trial is called plea bargaining. In most cases, the prosecutors will try to get the offender to plead guilty to a lesser charge with the commitment to recommend leniency to the judge at sentencing. Another popular tactic is called diversion. Diversion has been defined as follows. Based upon certain eligibility guidelines, offenders are diverted from the traditional criminal justice process, either before or after charges are filed, but prior to conviction or entry of judgment. criminal proceedings are suspended, conditioned upon the performance of specified obligations by the defendant, often including participation in counseling or treatment. Upon successful completion or compliance with the conditions of diversion, the case is dismissed. Some criticize the diversion tactic because it allows acknowledged sex offenders to escape the punishment they deserve. This also allows the offender to avoid having a conviction on their record. There is no data as to whether the offenders who are offered diversion ever recommit child sex crimes again.
In my case, my father was offered diversion. Along with that diversion, he was able to make the following concessions. 1. His sentence would not impose any jail time. 2. His guilty plea would be immediately followed by a sentencing to avoid spending 1 minute in jail awaiting sentencing. 3. The family would have to make a promise not to ask the judge to impose jail time in our victim impact statements. 4. The case would go before a specific judge who is known for not listening to victim impact statements. In the end, the defense rejected the diversion and made a motion to have the tape-recorded confession suppressed. Before the hearing for suppression of the tapes, the defense asked for the tape-recorded confessions. However, the prosecutor's office had lost them. My mother had to submit the tape-recorded confessions to the prosecutor's office 3 times throughout the 5-year period of the open case. My mother was told she would have to testify at the hearing for the suppression of the tapes. The day before the hearing, the prosecutors told her that they had to disclose a fact about the hearing. The disclosure was this. The defense attorney has a personal connection to the judge. A few years ago, the husband of the judge was running for a political office, and the defense attorney donated money to his campaign. My mother informed the prosecutors that KOMO 4 News would be attending the hearing and that she would make sure they were aware of this disclosure. The prosecutor seemed very nervous about the media being involved. The following morning, when my mother came to the hearing, she saw my father crying and very upset as he and his attorney were leaving the clerk's office. The prosecutors then told my mother that there had been a change. The judge that had originally been assigned to the case, the defense attorney's friend, had accidentally been given a docket that was too full. One case had to be reassigned to another judge, and it just so happened to be our case. The hearing went before Judge Andrus, and she did not suppress the tape-recorded confessions. My father waived his right to a jury, and the case was scheduled for an evidentiary bench trial.
Only 10% of all child sex abuse cases go to trial, yet most of the cases that do go to trial end in a conviction.
Why didn't my case end in a conviction? I believe it is because the prosecutors were convinced that the case would never make it to the trial, so they did not prepare the case for trial.
If a mother leaves her husband because he is sexually abusing the children and the case never leads to an investigation or a conviction, then the children are in an even more vulnerable situation. The father, who is not going to be punished for his crimes, can hire expensive family law attorneys to take the mother to family law court. The children could be left without financial resources to get counseling or to have their needs met. Or worse, the abusive father could have visitation rights to the children or could even file for custody of the children he has abused. On one hand, the mother is told that Child Protective Services will take the children away from her if she allows the children to be near the father, but if she divorces the father and he overtakes her in family law court, the abusive father could be given visitation or custody of the child without the mother there to protect the child. The mother often is left to raise her children in fear and poverty, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. This setup motivates many women to keep their children in an abusive home out of fear.
Directly after my father's criminal trial, he was given a paper to sign saying that he was no longer restrained from having child visitation with me. I have opened a fund called the Bailey Fund. The City of Chandler has reached out to the Gila River Casino for charitable grant money for the Bailey Fund. Shift the Shame campaign will use this grant money to assist victims of sexual abuse in getting needed counseling. What I think should happen in our justice system is that investigations of child abuse should start immediately after a report is made. The child sex offender should not be offered plea bargains or diversions. The victimized child should not have to testify in court. There should be a nationwide process to deal with child sex offenders. The most important goal of the process should be prevention of more child sex abuse victims. There should be a mandatory treatment program for all sex offenders. The offender should pay his own way through the treatment program. The offender should serve time in jail for a child sex crime after his treatment program has been completed. Those involved with the offender's treatment should have a say in the length of the jail sentence. For offenders who have shown rehabilitation in the treatment program, a 1-year jail sentence should be imposed to be served in full. For offenders who have not shown rehabilitation, a harsh prison sentence should be imposed to be served in full. All child sex offenders should be required to register as a sex offender for life. The nationwide process should be a one-time offer to offenders. If they reoffend, they should go to prison for life. What I think should happen in family law court is that child support from a child sex offender should be 50% of his income. Counseling related to the abuse should be paid for 100% by the offender, and child support should be non-modifiable.
As you can see, definite changes need to be made in our legal system. No family should have to endure this nightmare through our legal process.
Shift the Shame campaign will seek to promote changes in our criminal and family law courts. I encourage you to donate to the Bailey Fund so these changes can be made. Thank you for listening.